Well, the palate is actually, the roof of your mouth, the spot where peanut butter gets stuck, and where children who don't have a palate, there's just really nothing there between their nasal cavity and the roof of their mouth. So, and what we see more commonly is when children have the slit lip, cleft lip, and but both of them can be, devastating in their own way.
Is this more common in India than it is in other parts of the world, or are children born with the same proportions just treated differently?
No, it is more common in both India and China have the largest numbers of this, not just sheer population size, but actually per capita there are more.
Because of genetic reasons?
Well, it's interesting. They don't know exactly what causes a cleft. There is most likely a genetic component, but then you can also tie it with the prenatal nutrition of the mother. So the poorer the mother, the more likely she is to have a child. And the more malnourished the mother, more likely she has to have a child with this. But there is, even with that poverty level, there's still a higher concentration in India and China. But children in the States are born with clefts to a lesser degree, but it's covered by Medicaid. So every child born with a cleft here can receive free surgery and usually gets it within 3 months, which is the ideal time.
And I'm assuming that if it's treated that early, that there's less scarring than there is when it's allowed to go on for a while. These children are scarred both physically and emotionally, aren't they?
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. Less scarring in both cases. Yes, it's the surgery leaves less of a mark physically. But I think, the really dramatic thing is these young lives don't become defined by a birth defect that is so common and so easily cured. Even though it's, common on one degree, especially children living in isolated rural villages, they're often the only child there, or the only child, they or their neighbors have ever seen. So, the very common, there's different superstitions all around the world just because there's not enough public health education to tell families and, neighbors what has really happened. And most often it's considered a curse that the family has done something to anger the gods, and this is punishment. And so these young children live their whole life identified as being a punishment from above, and it's just, that's no life. I found out about the work in the film through the organization The Smile Chain, which supports Dr. Sabode's hospital, which is the hospital we spent time in, and was really drawn into their model. What they identified clefts as, this very common, easily cured birth defect, and recognized that it was something that was only going to be solved by empowering local doctors to do it. And so they work in 76 developing countries around the world, giving the funding and training when necessary to local surgeons. And it just made so much sense. Clefts actually weren't something on my radar, besides occasionally seeing an ad in the Sunday papers or something that just sort of hadn't taken hold. But once I sort of got pulled into what a huge impact it actually made on these young lives, that it was so far deeper than just the cosmetics. That pulled me in, and India, because it is one of the countries that has the largest concentration. And then actually what sold me on Uttar Pradesh, and Varanasi is the town where we focus, was my first conversation I had with Dr. Sabode, the surgeon. Our conversation had so little to do with medicine and surgery. His whole rhythm and mission to what he did, he was such an appealing individual. I wanted to spend time with him. And for character-driven films like ours is, and it's an observational style, casting is everything. And it always takes, a lot of gut and instinct, but also luck. For this one, though, I did feel like the scene where we see the social workers going out into the countryside and finding the children and meeting the parents for the first time and telling them that this, stigma and this defect that they thought their child was going to live their whole life with can be quickly and simply cured. So the challenge of being there with the cameras rolling at that time was tricky, and the pre-production strategy I came up with, I worked with a really great Indian field producer named Nandini Rajwati, and I sent her and one of the other social workers out into the field under the guise of being generic health researchers. So they met children with clefts and children with other health issues, and she sent me about a dozen children, little character sketches and photographs, and both Pinki and Gutru, the young boy that we follow in the film, really jumped off the page, and she recognized something that's one of my favorite parts of the film, that each of them had a uniquely strong bond with one of their parents, Pinki with her father, and Guturu with her mother. So then when we went back, we sent out Pankaj, the social worker who's actually in the film. We let him just sort of let him loose in that area and said, go about doing what you normally do, and we're along for the ride. And then luckily he ended up at Pinki's house. So they did have to be convinced that the surgery was safe, and they have to be convinced that it's possible, and that it's going to be free. And you know, the context that Pankaj, the social worker, helped me understand why it takes so much time is that, you know, these aren't families who've been given anything for free, so they're a little bit suspicious. And then, you know, one of the scenes I love with Guturu's mother is that, you know, she's like, you know, this is my son. I mean, yes, this is a hardship, but I love my son as he is. You have to prove to me this is safe. She was afraid, and who rightfully so.
And what about when a foreign film crew parachutes into a village like that?
Right. I mean, and they're already going through such an intense period. I mean, I work, you know, first off trying to establish a trust and explaining to them why I wanted to tell their story. And the interview you're referring to, I mean, it's to explain a documentary that's going to be, you know, shown on HBO when they have no concept of this. Pinki's from a village with no electricity, no television. They've never been to a movie before. But the way I explained it was just that we want to tell your story so other children and other families don't have to go through that hardship. And then, you know, really giving them control and letting them know that if there was ever a time they didn't want us to film, they just had to give the signal and we'd stop. So my strategy is usually just being a human being first and a filmmaker second, and it tends to work.